I'm Trisha, 31. At that family dinner, I still held a thin hope that maybe just this once I'd be seen. Instead, my father's words cut the air. "You're the biggest disgrace to this family." Everyone froze. And The clinking of silverware was the only sound that followed sharp against the velvet hush. My cheeks burned, but I kept my back straight, refusing to fold in front of their eyes. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever been brushed aside by your own family, hit subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. Last Thanksgiving came back to me in a flash, June. My sister stood tall as Dad toasted her new promotion. Glasses lifted, laughter spilled, pride on full display. I sat in the same seat I always had, my wine glass untouched, the words I longed to hear left hanging in the air. That memory pressed down on me as I sat at the mahogany table, now the crystal chandelier scattering light like shards across my plate. The house looked perfect, chandeliers, polished silver, roasted turkey, but I felt like furniture, present but unseen. June's laugh rang out, breaking the silence as she leaned closer to Dad, sharing another story about her success at work. His eyes shone with approval, a smile spreading across his face as if the world belonged to her. Mom kept her gaze low, folding her hands on her lap, pretending not to notice me. I tried to steady my breath, but the waiter skipping my glass at first, a tiny mistake was enough to tighten the knot in my stomach. It wasn't the first time I'd been passed over. Somehow, it always happened to me. I folded my napkin tighter between my fingers, my fork barely moving. Dad launched into another story about how our family stood for strength, loyalty, and legacy. His voice filled the room, but every syllable weighed heavy. I had nothing to add, no ground to stand on in that conversation. I traced the rim of my plate, pretending to listen, but I knew the subtext was clear. Trisha doesn't count. She never has. The words I dreaded came sharper this time. Dad paused, glass in hand, and looked straight at me. "Some of us bring pride," he said slowly, "and some only shame." The dining room went still, forks suspended in midair, eyes darting between us. My chest tightened, but I forced my lips into a faint smile. I wouldn't give them the spectacle they wanted. My silence became my shield. I looked down at the tablecloth, noticing how a spoon had slipped from someone's hand, lying forgotten on the floor. The details etched themselves into my mind, the way June's smirk reflected in the silver platter, the way Mom's fingers trembled around her glass. I thought of the letter Aunt Lillian once gave me, tucked in my journal upstairs. "One day they'll see you for who you are. Hold on." Tonight, I wondered if that day was finally coming, though no one else at the table would believe it. Not yet. I pressed the napkin against my lap, the fabric creased like my resolve. They thought I'd always sit quietly, a shadow at the table, while their laughter soared above me. They were wrong. The meal dragged on, though I hardly touched my plate. The roasted chicken and mashed potatoes cooled untouched in front of me, the steam long gone. June's voice filled the space, her laughter easy, her stories rehearsed to perfection. Dad hung on every word. I sat quietly, shifting my fork along the edge of the china, the scrape too soft to cover the growing silence around me. Mom adjusted her napkin, eyes flicking toward me, then away just as quickly. She wouldn't step in. She never did. Her silence was as heavy as Dad's judgment, an agreement without words. Across the table, June leaned back, smug, like she had already won some battle I hadn't even chosen to fight. Her smirk carved itself into my memory. The chandelier above swayed slightly, catching the light. I found myself staring at the crystals, each one sharp, beautiful, fragile. I thought of the countless dinners before my name, rarely spoken. My achievements ignored, my seat a placeholder more than a presence. Tonight wasn't new. It was only louder, clearer, harder to dismiss. My father's words still echoed. Some only shame. He didn't need to add more. The sting was enough. The weight of everyone's silence pressed in, and I knew every glance carried judgment. Yet even then, I felt something steady inside me. My fingers released the napkin. My hands lay flat on the table. I let the quiet linger, a different kind of answer. In that silence, I realized something: they expected me to bow my head, to shrink further, to vanish in plain sight. But my silence wasn't weakness. It was waiting. It was holding. and sooner or later they would see what they hadn't expected. Tonight was only the beginning. June leaned back in her chair, swirling the stem of her wine glass, her eyes glinting under the chandelier. "Not everyone here belongs at this table," she said lightly, though her gaze cut straight at me. The words slipped out sweet, polished, but sharp enough to sting. A ripple of uneasy laughter circled the table, but no one looked my way. I lowered my eyes, my fork tracing the rim of my plate again, the porcelain whispering under the pressure of my hand. Dad chuckled softly, nodding at June, his pride obvious. She went on about her new promotion, each detail polished to perfection. He clapped his hand on the table, his smile wide. "That's my girl," he said. The glow on his face wasn't just approval, it was ownership. The room seemed to lean toward her, everyone basking in her light. I sat still, half hidden in the shadows, my meal untouched. I thought of Aunt Lillian's letter folded in my journal at home. "One day they'll see you for who you are." "Hold on." The words steadied me, but the reality of the room was heavier. June shifted her eyes to me, lips curling. "And Trisha?" she asked, pausing for effect. "Still playing with that little project of yours." The silence afterward was worse than laughter. It was agreement. A couple of people chuckled anyway, as if on cue. My face heated, but I stayed quiet, keeping my hand steady on the fork, refusing to give them more. Mom looked down at her napkin, smoothing the fabric as if she hadn't heard. She had, of course. She always did. Her silence was the loudest voice at that table, her eyes fixed anywhere but on me. The weight of it pressed harder than June's words, harder than the faint laughs that rose and died in the air. I let my fork rest, my eyes focused on the flicker of the candle centerpiece. The flame bent with every breath of air, fragile but still holding. I thought about my podcast, the hours poured into stories, the small victories no one here would ever value. June's laughter rose again, Dad's voice adding warmth to her glow. "And me?" I stayed still, but something in my silence had changed. Dad set his glass down with a sharp thud that silenced the small laughter still circling the table. The stemware rattled against the mahogany, and everyone's eyes turned toward him. His smile vanished, replaced with a hard line, his jaw set. "Enough," he said, his voice low but heavy. "You've wasted enough years, Trisha. Tonight, I'll say it plain, you're the biggest disgrace to this family." The words landed like a blow, each syllable cold and deliberate. For a second, I could hear nothing but the hum of the chandelier above us. Mom's hand trembled against her glass, the wine within swirling dangerously close to the rim. June's laughter burst sharp and loud, filling the silence like nails on glass. She leaned back in her chair, tilting her chin with victory written across her face. I felt every eye fall on me, measuring, waiting, expecting. My breath stayed even. I kept my shoulders straight, though inside my heart pounded against my ribs. My fork lay still, abandoned on the plate. No words left my mouth. I didn't give them the scene they wanted. My silence stretched heavier than shouting could ever be. The air was thick, brittle. A waiter paused mid-step tray, held tight eyes darting nervously before he slipped back into the kitchen. The chandelier crystals caught the candlelight, scattering fractured beams across the table, across June's smirk, across Dad's scowl, across my own stillness. I thought again of Aunt Lillian's handwriting, "Hold on." So I did. My eyes lifted just for a moment, locking with June's. Her smirk faltered almost imperceptibly. Dad leaned back, impatient, waiting for my collapse. But I gave them nothing. The scrape of my chair had not come yet, but the resolve in me had shifted. They believed I was cornered. What they didn't know was that silence could be sharper than any word. Tonight, their certainty was about to crack. For a long second, no one moved. Even the candles flickered, as if the air itself had stiffened. I could feel June's eyes burning into me, waiting for me to shrink back. Dad's hand hovered near his glass, heavy with expectation. The silence pressed close, thick enough to choke, and then I pushed my chair back. The scrape echoed across the table, louder than any word spoken that night. June's smirk widened, certain I was about to storm off, but instead I stood tall, smoothing the napkin in my hand before placing it neatly on the table. My voice, when it came, was steady, cutting clean through the heavy quiet. perfect," I said. "Then erase me from your will, too." Gasps rippled like a wave. Someone at the far end dropped a fork. Mom's wine glass tilted, a splash of red spilled across the tablecloth. June's laughter stopped mid-breath, her face caught somewhere between triumph and shock. Dad froze his mouth slightly open, words caught in his throat. The chandelier light trembled against the crystals, scattering fractured beams across their stunned faces. At the end of the table, Mr. Harris, the family lawyer who had been mostly silent until now, cleared his throat. All eyes shifted as he adjusted his glasses, his expression calm but sharp. "Actually," he said slowly, "Trisha's name is still very much on the trust. After last quarter's review, she's the only one whose share has grown, independent of Reed accounts." The words landed heavier than my own. Heads turned. Whispers rose. June blinked, rapidly, color draining from her cheeks. Dad leaned forward, his jaw tight, but he had no immediate answer. The foundation of certainty they had always stood on wavered right before them. I didn't add anything. My silence carried more weight than any explanation could. The room itself seemed to tilt, shifting its focus. For once, the eyes that had looked past me now fixed on me, waiting unsure. And in that stillness I felt taller than I ever had. The air in the room shifted, the kind of shift you could feel in your chest before you heard it. For years I had been the shadow at this table, the one no one expected to rise. Now every eye lingered on me, their silence louder than any applause could have been. June sat rigid. Her smirk wiped away her fingers frozen around the stem of her glass. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Dad leaned forward, his jaw tight, his face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. For once, he didn't have a speech prepared, no booming words to control the room. He had been caught unguarded. Mom dabbed nervously at the spilled wine, her hand trembling. The stains spread wider across the white cloth, crimson under the chandelier light, impossible to ignore. It felt like a mirror of what had just happened, the damage out in the open for everyone to see. Mr. Harris's voice carried with a quiet authority that filled the vacuum. "It's remarkable, really," he continued, his gaze steady. "Trisha's independence is the only thing protecting this family's legacy from collapsing further." He let the words hang, his tone deliberate. There was no need to raise his voice. The truth was enough. The chatter at the far end of the table swelled, hushed questions, eyes darting, forks laid down. For the first time I didn't feel invisible. Their disbelief wasn't a wound, it was recognition, the kind I had never been offered freely. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stood there, the weight of silence circling me like armor. My words had been few, but they had landed. Mr. Harris's confirmation had sealed them. The chandelier swayed again, light scattering across the stunned faces of my family. And in that fractured light, I realized the balance had finally shifted. They weren't looking at June anymore. They weren't waiting for Dad's approval. They were looking at me. The moment stretched heavy but clear. I let the silence settle around us, a silence that said more than any speech could. Dad's hand clenched on the table, his knuckles white, but he didn't speak. June shifted in her chair, her face pale, her confidence drained. For years they had owned the stage. Tonight they had nothing left to say. I reached for my glass, lifted it calmly, and set it back down without a word. It was small, almost ordinary, yet the gesture carried a weight everyone in the room felt. No fury, no raised voice, just certainty. The kind that couldn't be taken back. Mr. Harris quietly gathered his papers, his work done, leaving my presence to speak for itself. Mom's eyes flicked toward me soft, with something like regret, but I didn't meet them. I wasn't here for apologies that came too late. Around the table, conversations faltered into whispers. Plates were untouched. Someone's spoon slipped clattering against porcelain before going still. The sound marked the end of an era in my family, the moment they realized I no longer needed their approval. I rose slowly from my seat. The chair scraped lightly against the floor, sharp in the silence. I didn't rush. I didn't explain. My steps toward the door were measured, steady, every movement deliberate. Behind me, no one called my name. Not Dad, not June, not even Mom. They stayed rooted in place, their silence, no longer my prison, but their own. I reached the hallway, the light softer there, away from the glare of the chandelier. For the first time, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My family's verdict no longer defined me. I glanced back once, not at their faces, but at the table, the wine stain spreading the papers left behind the frozen expressions. Then I turned away. My story had moved on. The night air met me as I stepped outside, cool and steady against my skin. The muffled hum of the dinner lingered behind the walls, but it no longer reached me. My heels clicked softly on the porch, each sound a reminder that I was leaving their world behind, not as an outcast but as someone who had chosen differently. Colin once told me that strength doesn't always roar, it often whispers. I finally understood. Tonight wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving to myself that I didn't need their stage to stand tall. A car passed slowly down the street, headlights brushing across the front windows, catching a glimpse of the frozen scene inside their postures, stiff, their power unraveled. For the first time, I wasn't looking in wishing for a seat. I was walking forward, steady and whole. At the curb, I paused, drawing in a long breath. The taste of freedom was subtle but sharp, like the first sip of black coffee in the morning. Behind me, I imagined June still seething, Dad, still gripping the table, Mom searching for words she should have said years ago. None of it mattered now. I didn't slam the door, didn't raise my voice. My exit was quiet, deliberate, the kind of ending that leaves more echo than sound. In that silence, my truth spoke louder than any of their accusations ever had. I slipped my keys from my purse, the metal cool against my fingers. As I unlocked my car, I caught my reflection in the window, calm eyes, steady hands. Not the disgrace they named me, but the woman I had always been, finally unshaken. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the night, and drove off without a backward glance. Behind me, their house stood dim, but ahead the road stretched open, waiting. Sometimes the loudest statement is made in silence, the steady step away, the door closing softly, the weight lifted without a word. Dignity doesn't beg to be seen, it simply stands. And when it does, those who dismissed it are left staring at the truth they can't erase.